In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, nestled between rolling green hills and endless farmland, lies the traditional Amish community of Cedar Valley. Here, where horse-drawn buggies still traverse dirt roads and electricity is forbidden, 17-year-old Sarah Miller lives under the crushing weight of her father's disappointment. Jeremiah Miller, a stern 45-year-old blacksmith and respected elder, has spent years trying to mold his daughter into the perfect Amish woman. But Sarah possesses a curious mind that questions everything, from why they can't use modern conveniences to how mechanical things work. While other girls her age excel at cooking, sewing, and preparing for marriage, Sarah struggles with even the simplest domestic tasks, earning her father's constant criticism and the community's whispered judgments. Unknown to everyone, Sarah has been secretly collecting discarded metal parts and studying mechanical principles, dreaming of creating something that could help her community while honoring their values. When a devastating drought threatens to destroy their crops and livelihood, Sarah's hidden talents and forbidden knowledge become the village's only hope for survival. This is a story about faith, family, acceptance, and discovering that sometimes the most unconventional paths lead to the greatest blessings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller farmstead as Sarah stumbled through the chicken coop, scattering feed with shaking hands. The rhythmic hammering from her father's blacksmith shop echoed across the yard like a countdown to her inevitable failure. "Sarah, where's my breakfast?" Jeremiah Miller's voice boomed from the house, carrying the familiar edge of irritation that had become as constant as the sunrise. 17-year-old Sarah Miller wiped her sweaty palms on her dark blue apron and hurried toward the kitchen, her heart already sinking. She knew what awaited her: another morning of disappointed sighs and barely contained frustration from the man who was supposed to love her unconditionally. The kitchen smelled of burned porridge and her mother's absence. Rebecca Miller had passed 3 years ago, leaving Sarah to fill shoes that felt impossibly large. Every morning since, Sarah had tried desperately to recreate her mother's perfect breakfasts, and every morning she failed in some small but significant way. "Father, I'm sorry. The porridge got a bit thick, but I made fresh biscuits," and Sarah's words tumbled out as she entered the kitchen, where Jeremiah sat at the heavy wooden table, his weathered hands folded in prayer. He finished his silent blessing and looked up at his daughter, with eyes that held more disappointment than love. At 45, Jeremiah Miller commanded respect throughout Cedar Valley. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of decades of honest work, while his stern jaw and deep-set brown eyes reflected the unwavering faith that had guided 5 generations of Millers on this same plot of Pennsylvania soil. "Thick porridge again," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He took a spoonful and winced slightly. "And it's lumpy. Mrs. Yoder's Martha is only 15, and she can make porridge so smooth it's like silk." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame as she placed the plate of biscuits beside his bowl. "I'll do better tomorrow, Father. I promise." "You promise every day, Sarah." Jeremiah's voice carried the weariness of a man who had given up hope. "Your mother could make a meal that would make the angels weep with joy. You can barely manage to not burn water." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she had learned long ago not to show how much they hurt. Instead, she busied herself wiping down the already clean countertop, her movements quick and nervous. "Mrs. Yoder mentioned yesterday that her Martha has already mastered 17 different pie recipes," Jeremiah continued, spreading butter on a biscuit with more force than necessary. 17, Sarah. How many do you know?" I can make apple pie," Sarah whispered. "One that actually tastes good?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Jeremiah sighed heavily and pushed back from the table. "I have to open the shop. The Hostetler boy is bringing his horse by for new shoes, and I can't keep customers waiting 'cause my daughter can't manage a simple breakfast." As he stood, his gaze fell on Sarah's hands, and his expression darkened further. "What is that black stuff under your fingernails?" Sarah instinctively curled her fingers, trying to hide the telltale smudges of oil and metal filings. I was cleaning the lamp last night and—" "Don't lie to me, Sarah." Jeremiah's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "That's not lamp oil. Where have you been?" The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Rasia searched for words that wouldn't make things worse. But there were no such words. There never were. "I was just exploring the old Brennan place," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "There are interesting things there." "Things?" Jeremiah's face flushed red. "What kind of things?" Machines. Broken equipment. I was just curious about how they... Curious." The word exploded from Jeremiah like a curse. "Your curiosity is what's wrong with you, Sarah. A proper Amish woman doesn't go poking around abandoned farms, getting dirty with worldly contraptions." He began pacing the small kitchen, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak ominously. "Do you know what Mrs. Stoltzfus said to me after service last Sunday? She said her daughter heard you asking questions about electricity." "Electricity, Sarah? As if our ways, the ways that have sustained our people for generations, aren't good enough for you." "That's not what I meant, Father. I just wanted to understand." "Understand?" Jeremiah stopped pacing and fixed his daughter with a stare that could have melted iron. "What you need to understand is that you're 17 years old and utterly useless. You can't cook, you can't sew properly. You spend your time daydreaming about worldly things, and you show no interest in finding a husband." Each word was a hammer blow to Sarah's already fragile self-worth. She had heard variations of this speech countless times, but it never got easier. If anything, the repetition made it worse, like a wound that was reopened before it could heal. "The Byler boy asked about you last month," Jeremiah continued, his voice rising. "A good boy from a good family. And what did I have to tell his father? That my daughter is so lost in her own world that she can barely function in this one. I didn't know he was interested," Sarah said weakly. "Because you don't pay attention to anything that matters." Jeremiah's fist came down on the table, making the dishes jump. "You're too busy with your curiosity and your exploring to notice that life is passing you by." From outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats saved Sarah from further verbal assault. Jeremiah straightened his vest and ran a hand through his graying beard, composing himself with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years hiding his family's shortcomings from the community. "That'll be young Hostetler," he said, his voice returning to its normal, controlled tone. "Clean this kitchen properly, and try not to embarrass me further today." He paused at the door, looking back at his daughter with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with so much frustration. "Sarah, I don't know what to do with you anymore. Your mother, she would be so disappointed." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like a judge's gavel. Sarah stood frozen in the kitchen, her father's final words echoing in the sudden silence. She would be so disappointed, the cruelest cut of all, because Sarah feared it might be true. Through the window, she watched her father greet young David Hostetler with the warm smile he reserved for everyone except his own daughter. Jeremiah Miller was well respected in Cedar Valley, known for his fair dealing, his skilled craftsmanship, and his deep faith. To the community, he was a pillar of strength and righteousness. Only Sarah knew the weight of living under that pillar when it seemed ready to crush you. She began clearing the breakfast dishes with mechanical precision, her mind already wandering to the hidden cache of metal parts she had collected from the abandoned Brennan farm. Old gears, springs, and pulleys that seemed to whisper possibilities to her in ways that recipes and sewing patterns never could. As she washed the porridge pot, scrubbing away the evidence of another culinary failure, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. Someday, somehow, she would prove that her curiosity wasn't a weakness. Someday, she would show her father and the entire community that there was more than one way to be useful. She just had no idea that someday was coming sooner than she thought, carried on the wings of a drought that would test everything she thought she knew about faith, family, and her own worth. Outside, Her father's hammer rang against hot metal, shaping iron into something useful and strong. Inside, Sarah dried the dishes and dreamed of doing the same with her life. The morning sun climbed higher, and the day began in earnest for the people of Cedar Valley. None of them knew that in a few short weeks, the quiet girl who couldn't make proper porridge would become their salvation. But first, she had to survive another day of being utterly, completely useless. 3 days later, Sarah crept through the tall grass behind the abandoned Brennan farm, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old farmstead had been empty for nearly a decade, ever since old Heinrich Brennan had passed and his children moved to Ohio. What remained was a treasure trove of forgotten machinery and mechanical wonders that the community had deemed too worldly to salvage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown property as Sarah approached the collapsed barn, where she had hidden her secret collection. Every step felt like a small rebellion against her father's words, against the suffocating expectations that seemed to grow heavier each day. She paused at the barn's entrance, listening for any sounds that might indicate she'd been followed. The only noise was the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Satisfied she was alone, Sarah slipped inside the weathered structure. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the rotting boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. In the far corner beneath a pile of moldy hay lay Sarah's most precious secret, a collection of gears, springs, pulleys, and metal pieces that she had been gathering for over 2 years. With practiced stealth, Sarah uncovered her cache and spread the components across a flat piece of wood she had positioned as a makeshift workbench. Each piece told a story of ingenuity and purpose, even in their broken state. A gear from an old threshing machine, its teeth worn but still functional. Springs from various contraptions, coiled tight with potential energy. Pulleys of different sizes, their surfaces polished smooth by years of use. But the crown jewel of her collection was a partially intact water pump mechanism she had discovered just last month. The brass fittings were tarnished green with age, and several crucial components were missing, but Sarah could see the elegant simplicity of its design. Water went in one end, and through a series of chambers and valves, it emerged from the other with greater pressure. As she examined the pump, Sarah's mind began working in ways that felt as natural as breathing. She could visualize how the missing pieces should look, how they would move in harmony with the existing components. It was like reading a language that no one had ever taught her, but somehow she understood perfectly. If I could find a way to create the missing valve assembly, she whispered to herself, running her finger along the worn brass surface, and maybe adapt these smaller gears to regulate the pressure. Lost in her mechanical meditation, Sarah didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. Well, what do we have here? Sarah's blood turned to ice as she spun around to find Daniel Hustetler standing in the barn doorway. At 19, Daniel was the oldest son of one of the most prominent families in Cedar Valley, and he had always made Sarah uncomfortable with his calculating stares and knowing smirks. "Daniel," she gasped, instinctively moving to shield her collection from his view. I was just playing with forbidden toys." Daniel stepped into the barn, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail of Sarah's secret workspace. My, Sarah Miller, I always knew you were different, but this is quite the surprise." Sarah's mind raced. Daniel's family held significant sway in the community, and if he reported her activities to the elders, or worse to her father, the consequences would be severe. "Please, Daniel, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can." Daniel picked up one of the gears and examined it with mock interest. "Tell me, does your father know his daughter spends her afternoons playing with worldly contraptions? Does he know you've been sneaking around abandoned farms like some kind of, what would you call it, inventor?" The way he said the word inventor made it sound like a disease. Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and anger in equal measure. "I'm not hurting anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to understand how things work. Understanding how things work isn't a woman's concern, Sarah. Especially not an Amish woman. Daniel set the gear down and took a step closer, his presence filling the small space in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. But I might be willing to keep your little secret for the right price. The threat hung in the air between them like a poisonous cloud. Sarah had heard whispers about Daniel Hostetler, about his wandering hands and his tendency to corner young women when no one was looking. She had always managed to avoid being alone with him before, but now she was trapped. "What do you want?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Daniel's smile was cold and predatory. "Nothing too complicated, just your cooperation. Your father thinks you're useless, but I think you might have your uses after all." Before Sarah could respond, Daniel grabbed her wrist with surprising force. "You see, Sarah, I've been watching you. All that sneaking around, all those curious questions you ask. I think you need someone to help you channel that energy in more appropriate directions." Sarah tried to pull away, but Daniel's grip tightened. "Let me go, Daniel. This isn't right. What's not right is a young woman thinking she can play with machines like a man," Daniel hissed, pulling her closer. "What's not right is you embarrassing your family with your strange ways. I can help you become more normal." As Daniel leaned in, his intentions becoming horrifyingly clear, Sarah's fear transformed into something harder and more focused. Her free hand closed around a heavy brass fitting from her collection. "I said, let me go." Sarah swung the brass piece with all her strength, connecting solidly with Daniel's shoulder. Daniel yelped and released her wrist, stumbling backward. "You little wildcat! How dare you! Stay away from me!" Sarah backed toward the barn's rear exit, clutching the brass fitting like a weapon. "If you tell anyone about this place, I'll tell everyone what you just tried to do." Daniel rubbed his shoulder, his face twisted with rage and embarrassment. "You think anyone would believe you over me? You think your word means anything in this community?" The terrible truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Daniel was right. Who would believe the strange, useless Miller girl over the respected Hostetler boy? "Maybe they wouldn't believe me," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. "But they might believe the bruises you'd leave if I let you have your way. And they'd definitely notice if I started screaming right now." For a moment the two young people stared at each other in the dusty barn, the weight of unspoken threats hanging between them. Finally Daniel's expression shifted from rage to something more calculating. "Fine," he said, straightening his vest. "Keep your little secret. But mark my words, Sarah Miller, your strange ways are going to catch up with you eventually. And when they do, don't expect anyone to come to your rescue." With that, Daniel turned and strode out of the barn, leaving Sarah shaking and alone among her scattered mechanical treasures. As his footsteps faded into the distance, Sarah sank to her knees, her whole body trembling from the encounter. The brass fitting fell from her numb fingers, clanging against the wooden floor with a sound like a bell tolling. She had always known that her curiosity and her fascination with machines put her at odds with her community's expectations. But until today, she hadn't realized how dangerous her differences could be. Daniel's threats echoed in her mind, mixing with her father's disappointed words to create a chorus of condemnation. Maybe they were all right. Maybe she was useless, strange, a burden on her family and community. Maybe her dreams of understanding and creating were nothing more than selfish delusions. But as Sarah looked at her collection of gears and springs, at the water pump mechanism that had sparked such vivid visions of possibility in her mind, she felt something stir inside her that was stronger than fear or shame. It was determination. She carefully gathered her mechanical treasures and hid them away. But she didn't abandon them. Instead, she made a promise to herself and to the memory of her mother, who had always encouraged her questions even when they seemed inappropriate. Someday, Sarah vowed, she would prove that her curiosity wasn't a weakness or a sin. Someday she would show them all that understanding how things work wasn't just a woman's concern. It was everyone's concern, especially when the survival of the community depended on it. She had no way of knowing that someday was less than 2 weeks away. racing toward Cedar Valley on winds that carried no rain and brought only the promise of drought and desperation. As Sarah made her way home through the lengthening shadows, she carried with her not just the fear of discovery, but also the first flickering flame of a plan that would change everything. The brass fitting had left a small bruise on her palm, where she had gripped it so tightly. As she walked, Sarah found herself hoping it would serve as a reminder, not of her fear, but of her strength. Behind her, the abandoned Brennan farm settled into evening silence, keeping its secrets for another day. 2 weeks after her confrontation with Daniel, Sarah woke to a world transformed by absence. The absence of the gentle morning rain that usually kissed the farmhouse roof. The absence of dew on the grass outside her bedroom window. The absence of the rich, loamy smell that typically rose from the earth after a night of natural watering. Instead, the air felt dry and brittle, like old paper ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Sarah dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements automatic after years of the same routine. But as she made her way to the kitchen to attempt another breakfast that would inevitably disappoint her father, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with worry. The hand pump at the kitchen sink, which usually produced a steady stream of clear well water with just a few vigorous strokes, now wheezed and gasped like an old man climbing stairs. After several minutes of pumping, only a thin trickle of brownish water emerged, tasting of minerals and desperation. "Father," Sarah called, her voice carrying a note of concern that seemed to echo strangely in the dry air. Jeremiah appeared in the kitchen doorway, his usually neat beard disheveled and his eyes shadowed with worry. He had clearly been awake for some time, probably checking the livestock and assessing the farm's water situation. "The well's running low," he said without preamble, his voice carrying none of its usual irritation with his daughter. For the first time in months, Sarah saw her father not as a disappointed critic, but as a frightened man facing a crisis beyond his control. "How low?" Sarah asked, setting aside her failed attempt at making coffee. "Low enough that we'll need to start rationing immediately." Jeremiah slumped into his chair at the kitchen table, suddenly looking every one of his 45 years. "I've been up since 3, checking every farm within walking distance. The Yoda's well is completely dry. The Stoltz fuses are down to maybe a week's worth. Even the Hostetlers with their deep well are starting to worry." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning airs. In a community that depended entirely on well water and natural rainfall for survival, a drought wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. "What about the creek?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Dried to a trickle, might be completely gone by week's end." Jeremiah rubbed his face with hands that trembled slightly. "Sarah, I've lived in this valley my whole life, and my father before me, and his father before him. None of us ever saw anything like this." The weight of genuine fear in her father's voice did something unexpected to Sarah. Instead of the usual anxiety that accompanied his disappointment, she felt a strange calm descending over her. Here was a problem that mattered more than burned porridge or uneven stitching. Here was a crisis that required not conformity, but solutions. "Father," she said carefully, "what if there was a way to bring water up from deeper in the ground, deeper than our wells can reach?" Jeremiah looked at his daughter with surprise. In their years of morning conflicts, Sarah had never shown interest in practical farm problems. "What do you mean?" Sarah's mind raced, thinking of the water pump mechanism she had been studying at the Brennan place. "I mean, what if we could build something that could reach the water that's still down there below where our wells end? Something that could bring it up with more force than a hand pump?" For a moment, Jeremiah stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, that would require machinery, engineering, skills that women aren't supposed to have." Sarah finished, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of their neighbor's rooster crowing to a sun that promised another day without rain. "Tell me what you're thinking," Jeremiah said finally, his voice carefully neutral. And so Sarah did. Sitting at the kitchen table where she had endured countless lectures about her inadequacies, she described the water pump mechanism she had discovered. She explained how it worked, how the missing pieces could be fabricated, how it could be adapted to draw water from greater depths than any hand pump could manage. As she spoke, Sarah watched her father's expression change from skepticism to surprise, to something that might have been hope. "You understand how this pump works?" he asked when she finished. "I think so. The principle is simple. It's just a matter of creating the right pressure, differentials, and having strong enough components to handle the load." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, processing not just his daughter's words, but the implications of what she was suggesting. Finally, he spoke. "Even if what you're saying is possible, who would build such a thing? I'm a blacksmith, Sarah, but what you're describing is beyond my abilities, and the elders would never approve bringing in outside help, especially not for something so worldly," Sarah supplied. "Different," Jeremiah corrected, but gently. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. "I could build it, Father. I could build it if you let me try." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Jeremiah stared at his daughter, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. "Sarah," he said slowly, "what you're suggesting goes against everything our community believes about women's roles, about accepting God's will, about letting our neighbors die of thirst, while we worry about propriety." Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Father, I've been studying mechanical things for years. I know it's not what you wanted for me. I know it's not what Mother would have expected, but it's what I'm good at. Maybe this is why God gave me this curiosity. Maybe this is his plan." Jeremiah stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at fields that should have been green with growing crops, but were instead brown and withering. "Show me," he said without turning around. "What?" "Show me this pump. Show me that you understand it as well as you claim." Sarah's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and terror. "You mean—" "I mean that desperate times call for desperate measures." Jeremiah turned back to face his daughter, and for the first time in months, his expression held no disappointment. "If you can truly build something that might save this community, then I need to see it. We need to see it." 2 hours later, Sarah led her father through the tall grass toward the abandoned Brennan farm, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She had never shared her secret sanctuary with anyone, and certainly never imagined that her first visitor would be her father. As they approached the collapsed barn, Sarah glanced at Jeremiah, trying to read his expression. His face was set in hard lines, but she couldn't tell if it was determination, disapproval, or simple resignation. "In here," she said, pushing aside the pile of hay that concealed her workspace. Jeremiah stepped into the barn and stopped short, his eyes widening as he took in the organized chaos of Sarah's collection. Gears, springs, and metal pieces were arranged with careful precision on her makeshift workbench. Sketches drawn on scraps of paper showed various mechanical configurations, and in the center of it all sat the water pump mechanism partially disassembled to reveal its inner workings. "Sarah," Jeremiah breathed, "how long have you been doing this?" 2 years, she admitted, watching his face for signs of anger. "Maybe a little more." Instead of anger, she saw something she had never expected: wonder. Jeremiah approached the workbench slowly as if he were entering a sacred space. He picked up one of Sarah's sketches, studying the careful diagrams and annotations. "You drew this?" "I was trying to figure out how to modify the pump housing to accommodate a longer drive shaft," Sarah explained, moving to stand beside him. "The original design was meant for shallow wells, but if we could extend this component here and add additional pressure chambers here." As Sarah explained her modifications, Jeremiah listened with growing amazement. His daughter, his supposedly useless daughter, was displaying a level of mechanical understanding that rivaled master craftsmen he had known. "The missing valve assembly," Sarah continued, pointing to an empty space in the pump mechanism. "I think I know how to make one. It would require some precise metalwork, But with your forge and tools, you want me to help you build this, Jeremiah asked. Sarah nodded, suddenly shy again. I can't do the precision metalwork myself. I need a real blacksmith for that. I need you, Father. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. For years their relationship had been defined by Sarah's failures and Jeremiah's disappointment. Now, suddenly, they were talking about working together, combining their skills for something larger than either could accomplish alone. Sarah, Jeremiah said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I owe you an apology. I've spent so long trying to make you into something you're not that I never bothered to see what you actually are. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. What am I, Father? Jeremiah looked at the water pump, at the careful sketches, at the organized workspace his daughter had created in secret. You're an engineer, he said simply. You're an inventor. You're brilliant. The words Sarah had longed to hear her entire life finally spoken. They hit her like a physical force. She had to grip the edge of the workbench to keep from swaying. Does this mean you'll help me? She whispered. Sarah, Jeremiah said, placing his weathered hand gently on her shoulder, I'll do everything I can to help you save our community. As father and daughter stood together in the abandoned barn, surrounded by the tools and dreams that Sarah had kept hidden for so long, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tall grass outside. Daniel Hostetler had been tracking Sarah's movements for days, and now he had discovered not just her secret workspace, but something far more dangerous. Proof that Jeremiah Miller was willing to support his daughter's worldly pursuits. Daniel smiled coldly and melted back into the grass. This information would be very useful indeed, especially when presented to the right people at the right time. But for now, Sarah and Jeremiah were lost in plans and possibilities, working together for the first time in years to build something that might save them all. The drought continued, the wells grew lower, and time was running out. But in an abandoned barn filled with gears and springs and dreams, hope was being born from the marriage of desperate need and hidden talent. The real test was yet to come. The Miller blacksmith shop had never seen anything like the controlled chaos that consumed it over the next 5 days. What had once been a place of predictable routine, horseshoes, plowshares and simple repairs, was transformed into something resembling an inventor's laboratory. Sarah stood at the great forge, her sleeves rolled up and her face streaked with soot, carefully heating a piece of brass that would become part of the water pump's valve assembly. The furnace roared like a living thing, its heat washing over her in waves that made her dark dress cling to her skin with perspiration. Steady now, Jeremiah coached from beside her, his voice carrying none of its old irritation, but instead filled with patient instruction. Brass is tricky, too hot and it becomes brittle, too cool and it won't forge properly. Watch for that golden-orange color. Sarah adjusted the bellows, her movements becoming more confident with each passing hour. For the first time in her life she felt truly useful, truly needed. Her hands, which had always failed at kneading bread and stitching seams, moved with natural grace when shaping metal. There, she exclaimed, as the brass reached the perfect temperature. It's ready. Jeremiah nodded approvingly and helped her transfer the glowing metal to the anvil. Together they began the delicate process of hammering the brass into the precise shape Sarah had designed for the valve housing. Each strike of the hammer was calculated, each adjustment deliberate. You're a natural at this, Jeremiah said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. I've been smithing for 25 years, and I've never seen anyone pick up the craft so quickly. Sarah beamed at the praise, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the forge's heat. It's like the metal wants to become what we need it to be. I can feel when it's right. As they worked, word of their project began to spread through Cedar Valley, though not in the way Sarah had hoped. The whispers started small. Questions about the unusual sounds coming from the Miller shop, Observations about Sarah's increasingly soot-stained appearance, speculation about what could require such intensive metalwork during the worst drought in living memory. The first direct confrontation came on the fourth day, just as Sarah was putting the finishing touches on a complex gear assembly that would regulate the pump's pressure. Jeremiah Miller, the voice that boomed across the shop, belonged to Bishop Eli Stoltzfus, the spiritual leader of Cedar Valley and a man whose word carried the weight of divine authority in the community. Sarah's heart sank as she saw the bishop approaching, flanked by two other elders, including Daniel Hostetler's father, Isaac. Their faces were set in expressions of stern disapproval that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Jeremiah straightened from the anvil where he had been working, setting down his hammer with deliberate calm. Bishop Stoltzfus, Brother Isaac, Brother Samuel, what brings you to my shop? Concerning reports. Jeremiah, very concerning report. Bishop Stoltzfus was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with piercing grey eyes and a white beard that reached nearly to his chest. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. We've heard that you and your daughter have been experimenting with worldly contraptions. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, but Jeremiah stepped protectively in front of her. We've been working on a solution to our water crisis, Eli. Nothing more, nothing less. A solution that involves your daughter engaging in men's work. Isaac Hostetler's voice dripped with disapproval. He was a smaller, rounder man than the bishop, but his words carried significant weight in the community. A solution that requires machinery and innovation instead of prayer and acceptance of God's will. God helps those who help themselves, Jeremiah replied firmly. And right now, our community needs help. Bishop Stoltzfus moved closer, his eyes taking in the modified water pump mechanism that Sarah had been so carefully assembling. This device, what is it? Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. It's a deep well pump, sir. It can draw water from much greater depths than our current hand pumps. It could mean the difference between survival and... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Between survival and accepting God's plan for us, Samuel Byler completed, his voice carrying the weight of religious certainty. Samuel was the youngest of the three elders, barely 40, but his devotion to traditional ways was absolute. Young woman, do you presume to know better than the Almighty? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on her, threatening to crush her newfound confidence. But then she looked at the water pump, at the precise metalwork she and her father had created together, at the elegant solution to a life-or-death problem, and found strength she didn't know she possessed. I presume to use the mind and abilities that God gave me, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I presume to care about whether my neighbors live or die, and I presume that the same God who created the principles of mechanics and engineering expects us to use them when our survival depends on it. The shock on the elders' faces was almost comical. In their decades of leadership, none of them had ever been so directly challenged by a young woman, especially not the supposedly meek and useless Sarah Miller. You see? Isaac Hostetler said, his voice tight with vindication. This is exactly what happens when women are allowed to venture beyond their proper sphere. First curiosity, then defiance, then outright rebellion against God's natural order. The natural order, Sarah shot back, her fear transforming into righteous anger, is for parents to protect their children and communities to care for their members. What's unnatural is standing by and watching people die of thirst because we're too proud to try something new. Sarah, Bishop Stoltzfus said, his voice carrying a warning, you forget yourself. No, Jeremiah interjected, moving to stand beside his daughter. She remembers herself. For the first time in years, my daughter remembers who she really is. The bishop turned his stern gaze on Jeremiah. And who is that exactly? She's the person who's going to save this community, Jeremiah said with quiet conviction. She's brilliant, she's determined, and she understands things about mechanics and engineering that the rest of us never learn. More importantly, she cares enough about our people to risk everything to help them. Risk everything. Samuel Byler asked, "What exactly is she risking?" Sarah and Jeremiah exchanged glances. They both knew the answer. She was risking excommunication, banishment from the only community she had ever known. She was risking her father's reputation and standing in Cedar Valley. She was risking everything that defined her identity as an Amish woman. She's risking being misunderstood by people who are too frightened of change to recognize a gift when they see one. Jeremiah said finally. The temperature in the shop seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of Jeremiah's words sank in. By supporting his daughter's unconventional pursuits, he wasn't just defending her, he was challenging the entire power structure of their community. Bishop Stoltzfus drew himself up to his full imposing height. Jeremiah Miller, you will cease this project immediately. Your daughter will return to her proper duties, and both of you will spend the next month in prayer and reflection, asking God's forgiveness for your pride and disobedience. And if we refuse, Sarah asked, though her voice trembled slightly, then you will face the consequences that await all who choose worldly wisdom over godly obedience, the bishop replied gravely. The threat of shunning hung in the air like smoke from the forge, to be cut off from the community, to become invisible to neighbors and friends, to be treated as if they no longer existed. It was a punishment that had broken stronger people than Sarah. But as she looked at the water pump they had built together, at the hope it represented for a community dying of thirst, Sarah felt something settle deep in her chest. It was the certainty that some things were worth risking everything for. "Bishop," she said, her voice steady now, "what if the pump works? What if it saves lives? Would that change your mind about God's will?" Bishop Stoltzfus considered this for a long moment. Finally he spoke. "If this device of yours can truly bring forth water from the depths, if it can prove itself without violating our principles of simplicity and humility, then perhaps we might reconsider our position." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but Isaac Hostetler quickly dampened it. "However," Isaac added, "if this contraption fails, if it proves to be nothing but worldly vanity dressed up as charity, then you will both submit to the community's judgment without question." It was an ultimatum disguised as a compromise. Sarah and Jeremiah had 3 days to prove their pump could work, or face the full consequences of their rebellion against tradition. 3 days, Bishop Stoltzfus confirmed. That's how long you have to demonstrate this. If it fails, or if it requires methods that violate our principles, then this discussion is closed forever. After the elders left, the shop fell silent, except for the dying whispers of the forge. Sarah slumped against her workbench, the weight of what they had just committed to settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Father," she whispered, "what if it doesn't work? What if I've been wrong about everything?" Jeremiah moved to stand beside his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, I've spent the last few days watching you work with metal, like it was clay in your hands. I've seen you solve engineering problems that would stump men with decades of experience. I've watched you pour your heart and soul into building something that could save lives." He paused, looking at the water pump with something approaching reverence. "If this doesn't work, it won't be because you failed. It'll be because some problems are bigger than any one person can solve. But I'd rather fail trying to help our neighbors than succeed at doing nothing." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of fear or frustration, but tears of gratitude for a father who had finally learned to see her for who she really was. "Then we'd better get back to work," she said, wiping her eyes and reaching for her tools. "We have 3 days to change the world." As father and daughter bent over their creation once more, the forge roaring back to life under Sarah's expert touch, neither of them noticed Daniel Hostetler lingering in the shadows outside the shop. He had been listening to every word of the confrontation, and his smile was cold with satisfaction. Everything was going exactly according to his plan. The final night before the test, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the pale moonlight, her mind racing through every component of the water pump they had built. Every joint, every seal, every moving part had been checked and rechecked, but still she worried. What if the leather gaskets failed under pressure? What if her calculations were wrong and the drive shaft couldn't handle the load? What if the valve assembly she had designed so carefully proved inadequate when faced with the reality of deep groundwater? At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to the kitchen. To her surprise, she found her father already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and his worn leather Bible open before him. "Can't sleep either?" Jeremiah asked softly, looking up as Sarah entered. She shook her head and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. The liquid was strong and bitter, nothing like her mother's perfect morning brew, but it was warm and comforting in the pre-dawn darkness. "Father," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him, "are we doing the right thing?" It was a question she had been wrestling with for days, not whether the pump would work. She was confident in the engineering, but whether they had the right to challenge their community's traditions so boldly. Jeremiah closed the Bible and looked at his daughter with eyes that held both love and uncertainty. "I've been asking myself the same question, Sarah. I've been reading about Moses, about how he struck the rock to bring forth water for the Israelites in the desert. And what did you find? I found that sometimes God works through human hands and human minds to provide what his people need." Jeremiah's voice was thoughtful, measured. Moses didn't just pray for water and wait for rain. He took action, even when it seemed impossible, even when others doubted. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "But Moses was chosen by God. I'm just Sarah Miller, the girl who can't even make decent porridge." "No," Jeremiah said firmly, reaching across the table to cover her hands with his own. "You're Sarah Miller, the young woman who sees solutions where others see only problems. You're Sarah Miller, who has the courage to risk everything for her neighbors. You're Sarah Miller, and I couldn't be prouder to be your father." The words hit Sarah like a physical embrace, warming her more than any coffee could. For so many years she had longed to hear pride in her father's voice when he spoke about her. Now, on the eve of the greatest test of her life, that dream had finally come true. "Whatever happens today," she whispered, "thank you for believing in me." "Whatever happens today," Jeremiah replied, "know that you've already succeeded in the most important way. You've shown me what it means to have faith in action, not just faith in words." As the sun began to rise over Cedar Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that promised another day without rain, father and daughter finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Today would determine not just the fate of their water pump, but the future of their place in the community they loved. By 7 o'clock it seemed like half of Cedar Valley had gathered at the Miller farm. Word of the test had spread through the community with the speed of wildfire, bringing the curious, the hopeful, and the skeptical in equal measure. Sarah stood beside the water pump they had installed over the community's deepest well, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The device looked smaller somehow in the morning light, less impressive surrounded by dozens of watchful neighbors than it had appeared in the privacy of their workshop. Bishop Stoltzfus approached with the other elders, their faces grave and ceremonial. "Sarah Miller," the bishop said in his formal voice, "you have requested an opportunity to demonstrate this device. The community is gathered to witness whether your claims have merit." Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Beside her, Jeremiah squeezed her shoulder in silent support. "Before we begin," Isaac Hustetler interjected, "I think it's important that everyone understand what we're witnessing here. This is not just a test of a machine, it's a test of whether our young people will submit to traditional wisdom or pursue their own prideful innovations." A murmur went through the crowd at Isaac's words. Sarah could see neighbors nodding in agreement, while others looked uncertain. The Yoder family, whose well had been the first to run completely dry, stood near the front with expressions of desperate hope. "Let her try," old Miss Yoder called out. Her voice cracked with thirst and desperation. "My grandchildren haven't had clean water in 3 days. If there's even a chance." "Martha Yoder speaks wisdom," said Samuel Byler, though his tone suggested he found the wisdom distasteful. "We will observe this demonstration, and then the community will decide what it means for our future." Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, some skeptical, some merely curious. These were her neighbors, people she had known her entire life. Their judgment would determine not just her own fate, but whether the engineering principles she had discovered would ever be accepted in their traditional world. "I need someone to help me operate the pump," Sarah announced, her voice carrying farther than she had expected. "The mechanism requires 2 people, one to maintain pressure, one to monitor the flow." She had expected her father to volunteer, but to her surprise, young David Hostetler stepped forward. At 16, David was Daniel's younger brother, but where Daniel was calculating and cruel, David had always been kind and curious. "I'll help," David said, ignoring his father's sharp look of disapproval. "David," Isaac Hostetler warned, "this is not appropriate. Neither is watching our neighbors die of thirst." David replied, his young voice carrying surprising firmness. "If Sarah's pump can bring water, then I want to help make it happen." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the boy. Having a Hostetler support her efforts, even Isaac's younger son, would mean something to the community. "Thank you, David," she said, then turned to address the crowd. "The pump works by creating a partial vacuum in this chamber here, which draws water up from deep in the ground. The pressure is then regulated by this valve assembly, which allows us to control the flow." As she explained the mechanism, Sarah could see understanding dawn on some faces, while others remained skeptical. Miss Yoder watched with the intense focus of someone whose life might depend on the outcome. "The key," Sarah continued, "is that we can reach water that lies far below the level of traditional wells, water that's still there, even during drought, because it comes from underground sources that don't depend on recent rainfall." "Enough talk," Daniel Hostetler called out from the back of the crowd, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Let's see if this contraption actually works, or if we're just watching more of Sarah Miller's useless daydreaming." Sarah felt her cheeks burn at the public humiliation, but she forced herself to focus on the task ahead. This was her moment, the culmination of years of secret study and weeks of intense collaboration with her father. "David," she said, "when I give the signal, begin pumping here. Keep a steady rhythm and watch this pressure gauge. If it goes into the red zone, stop immediately." David nodded, his face serious with concentration. Sarah positioned herself at the flow control valve, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Ready?" The crowd fell silent, even the children sensing the importance of what was about to happen. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the dust and desperation that hung in the dry air. "Begin," she said. David began pumping with strong, steady strokes. For the first few seconds, nothing happened except for the mechanical sounds of the pump engaging. Sarah watched the pressure gauge climb slowly from green toward yellow. Then, just as doubt began to creep into her mind, she heard it, the sound of water moving through pipes, the glorious gurgle of liquid responding to mechanical pressure. "It's working," David whispered, his voice filled with wonder. A thin stream of water began flowing from the pump's outlet. It was muddy at first, filled with sediment from the deep earth, but as Sarah adjusted the valve settings, the flow became clearer and stronger. The crowd pressed forward, hardly believing what they were seeing. Clear, clean water, more water than their hand pumps had produced in weeks, flowing steadily from the depths of the earth. "My God," Mrs. Yoder breathed, falling to her knees beside the stream. "It's real. It's actually working." Other families rushed forward, cupping their hands to catch the precious liquid. Children laughed with delight as they splashed water on their faces for the first time in days. Adults wept openly, overcome by relief and gratitude. But even as celebration began to spread through the crowd, Sarah noticed that the elders remained unmoved. Bishop Stoltzfus watched the flowing water with an expression that was impossible to read, while Isaac Hostetler's face was set in hard lines of disapproval. "Stop!" the bishop commanded, his voice cutting through the joy like a blade. The crowd fell silent, confused by the order. David stopped pumping, and the flow of water gradually ceased. "Bishop?" Sarah asked, her heart sinking. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Bishop Stoltzfus said, his voice carrying the weight of religious authority. "Is that this device, while impressive, represents exactly the kind of worldly innovation that our forefathers warned us against." A murmur of confusion ran through the crowd. They had just witnessed what seemed like a miracle, water from the depths of the earth during the worst drought in memory, and their spiritual leader was rejecting it. "The pump works," old Mrs. Yoder said, her voice shaky but determined. "It brings water when we need it most." "How can that be wrong?" "Because it encourages us to rely on human cleverness instead of divine providence," Samuel Byler answered. "Because it teaches our young people that traditional ways are insufficient, that innovation is more important than obedience." Sarah felt the world tilting around her. They had met every technical challenge, proven that the pump could provide the water their community desperately needed, and still the elders were prepared to reject it on philosophical ground. "With respect, Bishop," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "people are going to die without water. Children are going to die. How is letting that happen more godly than using the abilities God gave us to prevent it?" "God gave us many abilities, Sarah Miller," Bishop Stoltzfus replied, "but he also gave us wisdom to know when those abilities lead us away from his path." The tension in the crowd was palpable. Families who had seen their first clean water in days stood torn between their desperate need and their lifelong obedience to religious authority. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the debate. "Maybe," said a small, clear voice, "God sent Sarah to help us, just like he sent Moses to help the Israelites." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. To Sarah's amazement, it was Rebecca Yoder, Miss Yoder's 8-year-old granddaughter, the same child who hadn't had clean water in 3 days. "Rebecca," Bishop Stoltzfus said gently, "you don't understand the complexities." "I understand that I'm thirsty," Rebecca replied with the simple honesty of childhood. "And I understand that Sarah's machine made water come out of the ground. Isn't that like a miracle?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Here was a child, innocent of theological complexity and community politics, seeing the situation with perfect clarity. Sarah knelt down beside Rebecca, her heart breaking for this little girl and all the children like her. "Rebecca, what would you like me to do?" "I'd like you to turn the water back on," Rebecca said simply. "Please?" Sarah looked up at the crowd, then at the elders, then at her father. The faces surrounding her showed every emotion from hope to fear to stubborn resistance. The choice was hers. She could submit to the elders' authority and abandon the pump, preserving her place in the community, but condemning her neighbors to thirst. Or she could defy their judgment and turn the water back on, knowing that doing so might cost her everything. As she stood there, suspended between tradition and innovation, between obedience and compassion, Sarah realized that this moment would define not just her own future, but the kind of person she wanted to be. She walked back to the pump and placed her hand on the control valve. "Sarah," Bishop Stoltzfus warned, "think carefully about what you're doing." "I am thinking carefully," Sarah replied, looking directly into the bishop's stern eyes. "I'm thinking about Rebecca's thirst. I'm thinking about Mrs. Yoder's tears. I'm thinking about every family in this community who's watching their children suffer." She paused, her hand steady on the valve. "And I'm thinking that if God didn't want us to use our minds and abilities to help each other, he wouldn't have given them to us in the first place." With that, Sarah opened the valve, and water began flowing once again. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Families rushed forward to fill buckets and jars, their relief overwhelming their fear of religious authority. But the elders stood apart, their faces dark with disapproval and the promise of consequences to come. As Sarah watched her neighbors drink deeply of the water her pump provided, she felt a complex mix of triumph and dread. She had proven that her engineering could save lives, but she had also irrevocably challenged the authority structure that held their community together. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The test was over, but the real trial was just beginning. The shunning began at dawn. Sarah woke to an eerie silence that felt wrong in her bones. No sounds of neighbors calling morning greetings across fence lines, no clip-clop of horse hooves on the dirt road, no children's laughter drifting from nearby farms. Cedar Valley had turned its back on the Miller family. As Sarah made her way to the kitchen, she found her father sitting at the table with his head in his hands. Before him lay a formal letter, written in Bishop Stoltzfus's careful script. "Father," Sarah approached cautiously, dreading what the letter might contain. Jeremiah looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single night. "They've made their decision," he said simply, gesturing to the letter. "We have been placed under the maidik until further notice." The maidik, the shunning. Sarah felt the word hit her like a physical blow. In Amish communities, shunning was a spiritual death sentence, complete social isolation designed to bring wayward members back to conformity through the unbearable pain of separation. "What does that mean, exactly?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew. "It means no one in the community is permitted to speak to us, eat with us, conduct business with us, or acknowledge our existence in any way." Jeremiah explained, his voice hollow with grief. "It means we are invisible to everyone we've ever known and loved." Sarah sank into her chair, the full weight of what they had unleashed settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Even though the pump is working, even though people are getting the water they need, especially because of that. Jeremiah's laugh was bitter. "The elders can't admit that your solution works without admitting that they were wrong to oppose it. So instead, they've decided that we're the problem." As if to prove his point, the sound of approaching wagon wheels drew their attention to the window. Sarah watched as the Yoder family passed by on their way to market, Mrs. Yoder driving while her granddaughter Rebecca sat beside her. When Rebecca spotted Sarah in the window and raised her hand in a cheerful wave, Mrs. Yoder quickly pulled the little girl's arm down and turned her face away. The message was clear. Even the families who had benefited most from Sarah's pump were now forbidden to acknowledge her existence. "Mrs. Yoder looked so sad," Sarah whispered, watching the wagon disappear down the road. "They all do," Jeremiah replied. "But fear is stronger than gratitude, Sarah. Fear of being shunned themselves, fear of challenging authority, fear of being different." The days that followed passed like a waking nightmare. Sarah and Jeremiah maintained their farm as best they could, but without the community cooperation that made Amish life possible, every task became exponentially harder. When their plow horse threw a shoe, no one would sell them iron for repair. When their grain stores ran low, no one would trade with them. When Sarah fell ill with a fever, no one would come to help with the household duties. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the gradual silence that settled over their water pump. Each morning Sarah would check the flow and find it strong and steady, providing more than enough water for multiple families. But the well sat unused, the life-saving water flowing into the ground, while families throughout the valley continued to struggle with their failing shallow wells. On the 5th day of their isolation, Sarah discovered why. She was returning from feeding the chickens when she spotted Daniel Hostetler standing guard near their well, his arms crossed and his expression set in hard lines of authority. "Daniel," Sarah said, approaching cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "Making sure no one violates the bishop's orders," Daniel replied, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Sarah's skin crawl. "The elders have decided that using your device would be the same as endorsing your rebellion. So I've been assigned to ensure that no one is tempted to compromise their spiritual welfare for the sake of physical comfort." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're preventing people from getting water. Water they desperately need. I'm protecting them from spiritual contamination, Daniel corrected with a smug smile. Your pump may provide water for the body, Sarah, but it poisons the soul. Better to suffer in righteousness than to prosper in rebellion. The casual cruelty of his words hit Sarah like a slap. Here was proof that the community's rejection of her pump wasn't really about tradition or theology. It was about power and control, about maintaining the existing order even when that order was literally killing people. You can't be serious, Sarah said, her ruse rising with incredulity. There are children in this valley who haven't had clean water in over a week. Mrs. Byler's baby is sick from drinking contaminated creek water, and you're standing here preventing them from getting help because of pride. Not pride, Daniel said, stepping closer with that predatory smile she remembered from their encounter in the barn. Principle. Something you've never understood. The only principle I see here is your principle of keeping people desperate so you can control them, Sarah shot back, her fear giving way to righteous anger. Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by something much more dangerous. Careful, Sarah. You're already walking on thin ice with the community. Don't make your situation worse by adding disrespect to your list of sins. What situation could be worse than watching children suffer when I have the ability to help them? The situation where you and your father are permanently expelled from Cedar Valley, Daniel said coldly. The situation where you lose not just your community, but your home, your livelihood, everything you've ever known. Because that's exactly what will happen if you continue this path of defiance. The threat was clear and devastating. Complete exile from the Amish community was a fate worse than death for most members. It meant losing not just friends and neighbors, but identity itself. Sarah felt her resolve wavering under the weight of such consequences. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe her rebellion was selfish, driven more by pride than genuine care for others. Maybe the cost of defying tradition was simply too high. But as these doubts consumed her, Sarah heard something that changed everything, the sound of crying from the direction of the Byler farm. "That's Martha Byler," Sarah said, recognizing the voice of a woman she had known since childhood. "Her baby, the baby is sick from bad water." Daniel shrugged with callous indifference. "These things happen. God's will be done." The casual dismissal of a child's suffering shattered something inside Sarah. All her doubts, all her fears about defying authority, all her worry about community acceptance suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the sound of a mother weeping for her sick infant. "Get away from my pump," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. "I beg your pardon. I said get away from my pump, now." Daniel laughed, but there was nervous edge to it. "You can't make me, Sarah. I have the authority of the elders behind me. And I have something more important than authority," Sarah replied, moving toward the pump with purposeful strides. "I have the ability to help that baby, and I'll be damned if I let your politics stop me." "Sarah." Daniel lunged forward to grab her arm, but Sarah was ready for him this time. She spun away from his grasp and positioned herself protectively in front of the pump. "Touch me again, Daniel, and I'll scream loud enough for the whole valley to hear. And this time I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Daniel's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but he didn't advance. Instead, he took a step back and pointed an accusing finger at her. "This isn't over, Sarah Miller. You think you're so clever with your machines and your defiance, but you're just a foolish girl playing with things you don't understand. And when this community finally sees you for what you really are, don't expect anyone to stand with you." With that, Daniel stalked away, leaving Sarah alone with her pump and the sound of crying that continued to drift across the valley. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just done. By openly defying Daniel's authority, she had essentially declared war on the power structure that governed her entire world. But as the crying grew louder and more desperate, Sarah's hesitation evaporated. She activated the pump and filled a large bucket with clean water, then set off across the fields toward the Byler farm. The walk took only 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing an ocean. With each step, Sarah was moving further from the world she had always known, and into territory that none of her community's traditions had prepared her to navigate. She found Martha Byler in her kitchen, holding her 18-month-old son Joshua, while tears streamed down her face. The baby's skin was flushed with fever, his tiny body limp with dehydration. "Martha," Sarah called softly from the doorway. Martha looked up, startled to see the shunned girl standing in her home. For a moment, confusion and desperation warred across her face. "I brought clean water," Sarah said simply, setting the bucket just inside the door. "From the deep well. It's safe for the baby." Martha stared at the water as if it were a mirage. "Sarah, we're not supposed to. Your baby is dying, Martha. Nothing else matters right now." The brutal honesty of Sarah's words broke through Martha's conflicted loyalties. She rushed to the bucket and filled a cup with clean water, then used a cloth to let small drops fall into her son's mouth. The effect was almost immediate. Joshua's eyes fluttered open, and he made small sucking motions with his lips, desperate for more of the life-giving liquid. "Oh, thank God," Martha breathed, tears of relief replacing tears of despair. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much." But even as she spoke the words of gratitude, Martha's eyes were filled with confusion and pain. She was caught between her need to help her child and her fear of violating community rules. "Martha," Sarah said gently, "I'm going to leave this bucket here. What you do with it is your choice. But I want you to know that there's more where this came from, as much as your family needs." As Sarah walked home across the dry fields, she carried with her the image of little Joshua's eyes opening, of a mother's tears turning from despair to relief. Whatever the cost of her defiance, whatever consequences awaited her and her father, she knew in her heart that she had done the right thing. But she also knew that Daniel had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. The battle for the soul of Cedar Valley had only just begun, and Sarah Miller had just positioned herself at the center of it. Behind her, the Byler farmhouse was quiet except for the gentle sounds of a baby drinking clean water for the first time in days. Ahead of her, storm clouds were gathering that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the price of progress in a world that feared change more than death itself. 1 week after the shunning began, tragedy struck Cedar Valley with the devastating force that only nature can deliver. Sarah was in the barn, milking their remaining cow. The others had been sold because they couldn't afford feed without community trading networks when she heard the scream. It was a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the morning air, a mother's anguish so profound that it made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. She abandoned the milk bucket and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. The screaming was coming from the Stoltzfus farm, where Bishop Eli's family lived in a white farmhouse that had always represented the moral center of their community. What Sarah found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Anna Stoltzfus, the bishop's wife, was kneeling beside their well, cradling their 4-year-old grandson Timothy in her arms. The little boy was unconscious, his skin gray with dehydration, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. "Anna," Sarah called out, rushing toward them despite knowing she wasn't supposed to acknowledge their existence. Anna looked up with eyes wild with desperation and maternal fear. For a moment the rules of shunning meant nothing compared to the terror of watching a child die. "Sarah," Anna gasped. "He won't wake up. He drank some water from the creek yesterday, and now he won't wake up. I don't know what to do." Sarah knelt beside them, her mind racing. Timothy's symptoms were classic signs of severe dehydration, complicated by waterborne illness. The contaminated creek water that had become many families' last resort was making the crisis exponentially worse. "Anna, he needs clean water immediately and probably medical attention," Sarah said urgently. "How long has he been like this?" "Since before dawn, Sarah. Please, I know we're not supposed to speak to you, but he's my grandson. He's just a baby." The agony in Anna's voice cut through Sarah's heart like a blade. Here was a woman caught between her love for a dying child and her obligation to religious authority, and the religious authority was her own husband. "Where's the bishop?" Sarah asked. Gone to Lancaster with the other elders. Some kind of meeting about you and your father. Anna's voice broke on the words. They left before Timothy got sick. They won't be back until evening. Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest. The community's leaders had abandoned their own families to discuss punishment for the very people who could provide help. Anna, listen to me, Sarah said, her voice urgent and clear. I can help Timothy, but you have to trust me. I have clean water at my farm, and I know what to do for dehydration, but we need to move quickly. Anna stared at Sarah with the desperate calculation of a mother weighing social taboo against her child's life. The choice took less than 3 seconds. Help him, Anna whispered. Please, Sarah, help my grandson. What happened next would become legend in Cedar Valley, though the details would be debated for generations. Sarah carried little Timothy back to her farm, with Anna running alongside them, both women driven by an urgency that transcended all social boundaries. At the Miller farm, they found Jeremiah waiting with buckets of clean water from the pump and strips of clean cloth for cooling compresses. For the next 6 hours, Sarah and Anna worked together to save Timothy's life, with Jeremiah providing whatever assistance he could. They administered small sips of clean water at carefully timed intervals, used cooling cloths to bring down his fever, and monitored his breathing with the intensity of seasoned physicians. Sarah had learned these techniques from her mother, who had served as an unofficial healer in the community before her death. But it was Sarah's pump that provided the endless supply of clean water that made the treatment possible. By mid-afternoon, Timothy's eyes fluttered open. By evening, he was sitting up and asking for his mother, in the thin, reedy voice of a child who had come very close to crossing the final threshold. Anna wept with relief so profound, it seemed to shake her entire body. Sarah, she sobbed, you saved him. You saved my grandson's life. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the sound of multiple wagon wheels announced the return of the community elders from Lancaster. Sarah watched through the kitchen window as Bishop Stoltzfus, Isaac Hustetler, and Samuel Byler approached the farmhouse, their faces set in expressions of grim purpose. Behind them came Anna's husband, David Stoltzfus, and Anna herself knew she was in terrible trouble. Anna, Bishop Stoltzfus's voice boomed across the farmyard. What is the meaning of this? Anna emerged from the Miller farmhouse, carrying Timothy, who was now alert and drinking clean water from a cup. The sight of his wife fraternizing with the shunned family hit the bishop like a physical blow. Eli, Anna said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Timothy was dying. Sarah saved his life. Timothy was dying. Bishop Stoltzfus's stern expression cracked for a moment, revealing the grandfather beneath the religious authority. What happened? Why wasn't I told? You were in Lancaster, Anna replied simply, and Sarah was here. The implication hung heavy in the evening air. While the community's leaders had been away discussing punishment for the Miller family, that same family had been saving the bishop's grandson's life. Isaac Hostetler stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. This is exactly why the meeting exists, to prevent contamination, to keep our people from being led astray by worldly thinking. My grandson is alive because of worldly thinking, Anna said quietly, but her words carried across the farmyard like thunder. My grandson is alive because Sarah Miller knew how to treat dehydration and had clean water to give him. Your grandson is alive because God willed it, Samuel Byler corrected sternly. Any human intervention was merely the instrument of divine providence. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. For weeks she had endured criticism, threats and isolation, while trying to help her community. She had watched children suffer while adults played political games with their welfare. She had seen her life's work dismissed as pride and rebellion, while people died of preventable causes. Stop it, she said, her voice cutting through the theological debate like a knife. Viron turned to look at her, surprised by the sudden authority in her tone. Just stop it, Sarah continued, stepping forward to face the elders directly. Stop pretending this is about God's will or spiritual purity or protecting tradition. This is about you being afraid to admit that you were wrong. Sarah Miller, Bishop Stoltzfus warned, you go too far. Do I? Sarah's voice rose with each word, years of suppressed frustration finally finding release. Because from where I stand, it looks like I haven't gone far enough. I built a machine that can save lives, and you rejected it, not because it doesn't work, but because it threatens your authority. She gestured toward Timothy, who was drinking clean water while nestled safely in his grandmother's arms. Look at him. Look at that little boy who's alive right now because I refuse to accept your judgment. Tell me that saving his life was wrong. Tell me that letting him die would have been more godly. The crowd of elders shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to their authority. They were accustomed to obedience, to deference, to the quiet submission that had defined Amish community life for generations. Sarah, her father said softly, placing a warning hand on her arm. But Sarah was beyond caution now. No, father, I'm done being quiet. I'm done accepting judgment from people who care more about maintaining power than saving lives. She turned back to the bishop, her young face blazing with righteous fury. You want to shun me? Fine. You want to treat me like I don't exist? I can live with that. But don't you dare stand there and tell me that watching children suffer is God's will when I have the knowledge and ability to help them. The words echoed across the farmyard like gunshots. For a moment the only sounds were the evening breeze rustling through dry corn stalks and little Timothy's contented drinking. Then Bishop Stoltzfus spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of final judgment. Sarah Miller, he said formally, by your own words you have chosen worldly wisdom over spiritual submission. You have chosen pride over humility, rebellion over obedience. Therefore, I declare that your mating is now permanent. You and your father are no longer welcome in this community. The pronouncement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Permanent exile, complete severance from everything she had ever known. She had gambled everything on the hope that saving lives would matter more than preserving persons, and she had lost. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah heard Anna Stoltzfus speak in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the still evening air. Then I choose to be exiled with her. The shock on Bishop Stoltzfus's face was absolute. His own wife, the woman who had stood beside him for 30 years, was openly defying his authority to support the shunned girl. Anna, he whispered, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Eli. I'm saying that any community that would rather watch children die than admit it made a mistake is not a community worth preserving. Anna stood tall, still holding Timothy, her voice gaining strength with each word. I'm saying that Sarah Miller has more godliness in her little finger than some people have in their entire bodies. One by one, other voices began to join Anna's. She's right, called out David Yoder, emerging from the gathering dusk. Sarah's pump has kept my family alive for the past week. If supporting her means exile, then exile me too. And me, said young David Hostetler, stepping forward despite his father's furious expression. The girl saved my grandson, old Mrs. Yoder added, her voice cracked but determined. Count me with her. Sarah watched in amazement as neighbor after neighbor stepped forward, choosing to stand with her despite the terrible cost. These were people she had grown up with, families she had known her entire life, and they were willing to risk everything to support her right to help them. But they were still outnumbered by those who remained silent, paralyzed by fear or genuine belief that the elders were right. Bishop Stoltzfus looked at the growing group of supporters with an expression of profound grief. These weren't rebels or troublemakers, they were the heart of his congregation, good people driven to desperate choices by desperate circumstances. This community is tearing itself apart, he said quietly, and for the first time Sarah heard uncertainty in the bishop's voice. No, Sarah replied, her voice steady now despite the tears streaming down her face. This community is trying to save itself, but some people are more afraid of change than they are of death. As darkness settled over Cedar Valley, two groups stood facing each other in the Miller farmyard, those who supported progress and those who clung to tradition. Between them lay a chasm that seemed impossible to cross, widened by pride, fear, and the terrible weight of consequences that none of them had fully anticipated. The drought continued. The wells remained dried, and in the morning, half of Cedar Valley would wake up as exiles from the only world they had ever known. But they would wake up alive, with access to clean water and the knowledge that they had chosen compassion over conformity. It was a choice that would change everything. 6 months later, the first spring rain in over a year fell gently on Cedar Valley, pattering against the windows of the small schoolhouse where Sarah Miller stood before a room full of children. "Now," she said, holding up a simple gear mechanism, "who can tell me how this works?" 8 eager hands shot into the air. Amish children and formerly Amish children alike, their eyes bright with curiosity that was no longer forbidden. Among them sat Timothy Stoltzfus, now a healthy, energetic boy who had appointed himself Sarah's most devoted student. "Miss Sarah," Timothy called out, bouncing in his seat. "The teeth push against each other and make them turn." "Very good, Timothy," Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride at his enthusiasm. "And what does that teach us about working together? That when we help each other, we can move big things," piped up Rebecca Yoder, now 9 years old and as mechanically minded as her teacher. The door at the back of the classroom opened quietly, and Sarah looked up to see her father entering with Bishop Stoltzfus. The sight of them together still amazed her, two men who had once stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide, now working together to rebuild their fractured community. The changes in Bishop Stoltzfus had been the most remarkable transformation of all. The near loss of his grandson had shattered his certainty about the righteousness of rejecting innovation. Over the winter months, as Sarah's pump continued to provide life-sustaining water while traditional wells remained dry, he had undergone a spiritual crisis that ultimately led to a profound change of heart. "Children," the bishop said gently, "Miss Sarah has a visit." Sarah turned to see Anna Stoltzfus entering the classroom, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came Martha Byler, Mrs. Yoder, and a delegation of women from throughout the valley, women whose families had survived the drought because of Sarah's engineering. "Ladies," Sarah said, puzzled by the formal nature of their visit, "what brings you here?" Anna stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. In her hands she carried a beautiful quilt. Not just any quilt, but a masterpiece of needlework that incorporated unusual pattern Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah Miller," Anna said, her voice thick with emotion. "For months we watched our children suffer while we honored traditions that seemed more important than their lives. You showed us that sometimes the most sacred tradition of all is caring for one another." She held up the quilt, and Sarah gasped as she recognized the pattern. It wasn't flowers or geometric shapes, like traditional Amish quilts. Instead, it depicted the intricate workings of a water pump, with gears and pipes and flowing water rendered in exquisite detail with tiny perfect stitches. "We made this together," Martha Byler added, stepping forward. "Every woman whose family you saved contributed. It's our way of saying that your gifts, all of your gifts, are welcome here." Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she accepted the quilt. The weight of it in her hands represented more than fabric and thread. It represented acceptance, understanding and love from the community that had once rejected her. "There's something else," Mrs. Yoder said, her aged voice trembling with emotion. "We've been talking, all of us, about how to make sure this never happens again. How to make sure that when someone in our community has gifts that could help others, we listen instead of judging." Bishop Stoltzfus stepped forward, his weathered face soft with humility. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my grandson's life, and I owe this community an acknowledgement of my own blindness." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I spent so many years believing that preserving our ways unchanged was the same as preserving our faith. But you taught me that true faith sometimes requires us to change, to grow, to use the minds and abilities God gave us in service of His greatest commandment, to love one another. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the bishop continued. Therefore, with the blessing of the community, I want to offer you a new role among us, not as someone who must conform to expectations that never fit her, but as our first community engineer, a position we're creating because we finally understand how much we need people like you. The classroom erupted in cheers from the children, who had been watching the adult drama with wide eyes. Timothy jumped up from his seat and ran to hug Sarah's waist, his small arms squeezing tight. "Miss Sarah is going to stay forever and ever," he announced with the absolute certainty of childhood. Sarah looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Children, eager to learn, women who had become unlikely allies, elders who had found the courage to admit their mistakes, and her father, whose eyes shone with more pride than she had ever imagined possible. "Forever and ever," she repeated softly, hugging Timothy close. As the spring rain continued to fall outside, filling creeks and replenishing wells throughout Cedar Valley, Sarah Miller stood in a schoolhouse where tradition and innovation had learned to dance together. The girl who had once been mocked as useless had become the bridge between an ancient way of life and a future where curiosity was celebrated rather than condemned. The water pump still hummed quietly at the Miller farm, no longer needed for emergency survival, but maintained as a symbol of what was possible when communities opened their hearts to change. And in the school where Sarah now taught both traditional skills and basic engineering, a new generation was learning that the greatest strength came not from choosing between old ways and new ideas, but from weaving them together like threads in a quilt. Sarah Miller had indeed changed the village, but not in the way anyone had expected. She had changed it not through the force of her invention, but through the power of her love. Love that was strong enough to risk everything, wise enough to seek solutions, and patient enough to wait for understanding to bloom like flowers after a long, hard winter. The machine had brought water to Cedar Valley, but Sarah had brought something far more precious. She had brought hope.